I was in an alcohol-related drunk driving accident. My best friend and I were passengers, and she passed away from that accident, unfortunately. And I wish I could tell you that I stopped drinking. I wish I could tell you that was a wake-up call, but unfortunately, I used alcohol and substances as a coping mechanism.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Howard Stribbell, and I'm really pleased that you can join us for the 21C Education Vanguard. Justin is playing producer today and letting me step in front of the camera. And I get a real privilege of being able to introduce our guest to you today to share more about mental health. As many of you know, October 10th was World Mental Health Day, and it's a time for us to focus on mental health. And so I thought it would be really good to bring in our guest today to share more about how mental health affects students and what schools can be doing about it. So please welcome Diana Hume McDowell to the Education Vanguard and her company East West Prevention. So student mental health and addictions counseling is a real focus for East West Prevention. So tell us a little bit what East West provides for schools and for families.
Sure. So we are a substance misuse prevention organization, and about 80% of the work that we do is empowering young people with the information that they need to make healthy choices when it comes to preventing substance misuse and addiction. Obviously, mental health ties into that, and ultimately, we just want these young people to have the skills and the information they need when they go out in the world and they're faced with alcohol, nicotine, potentially marijuana overseas, how to identify problematic use, how to intervene on themselves or their friends or the family members if they start to show signs of concern. And overall, the conversation is about mental health and wellness.
Yeah, and I think it's important for us to talk about addictions because I think mental health is being more acceptable now. We're talking about it now, but we really aren't talking about addictions, especially when it comes to young people. And is this a growing concern in schools, in international schools with young people?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's always a concern.
Mm-hmm.
I think that depending where in the world you are, those risks look a little bit different. In the United States, the risk for substances is going to look different than here in Asia, than Europe, than in Latin America. But substances are everywhere.
Yeah.
And what we know about the teenage brain is that it's particularly vulnerable to the presence of a mind-altering substance or any, potentially high dopamine releasing activity. And so we want to make sure that kids and their families have the information they need to protect themselves.
I know you have experience in America and now here in Asia as well. So maybe just tell our listeners a little bit about your own story and how East West Prevention came about.
Sure. So I was actually raised here in Hong Kong, and I was born to two really loving parents. Both of them have advanced degrees. And the reason I say that is because I don't fit the profile for somebody who would typically go down that path of substance misuse.
Yeah, that stereotype, right? We have this idea of the bad friends or the bad influencers. They're the ones who get into that kind of a situation.
Right. Or somebody
maybe come from a challenging home or a situation.
Trauma, divorce, poverty. And I didn't check any of those boxes. I grew up in a loving family. I had a lot of opportunities, education-wise. But I also had a lot of risk factors that I didn't know about. My father, he had lifelong struggles with mental illness and really brilliant guy. He has a PhD in nuclear engineering. But
literally a rocket science.
Yes, exactly. But just a lot of lifelong challenges and then prescription medication overuse. I had undiagnosed ADHD growing up. I moved a lot as a child, and third culture kids, they can be at risk for risky behaviors when they're processing the moves and all that stuff.
How to make connections, right? And so sometimes that becomes something that they may make some wrong choices about as well.
Exactly. There's so many advantages that come along with, moving around, but there's also risks, processing the grief of leaving a place and then trying to form your identity over and over again. And so when I was 16, I made the move from Hong Kong to New York. And suddenly I was in this new place and I had all these preconceived notions of what it meant to be an American teenager that were influenced by pop culture, right? And one of those was, to be an American teenager, you drink and smoke cigarettes. And so what started out as really seemingly harmless behaviors progressed over the years. And in my case, I was still presenting as okay on the outside. I had, decent grades. I got into a good college. I even had an internship at a Wall Street hedge fund. And so I think that my parents and myself included, we just didn't realize that the risks that I was taking were that risky.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on something there twice now. One, you come from a background which wouldn't stereotypically be associated with substance misuse. And I think also as a high functioning person, that also helps us masquerade our poor choices or our misuse, right?
Yes.
And it masks it until
Absolutely.
It becomes a bigger problem.
Right, absolutely. Because growing up, I was always fed the message that do well in school, get a good job. And I did both.
Right.
So, it didn't really matter if I was, binge drinking on the weekends and smoking and sometimes dabbling in other, risky behaviors.
And sometimes we even consider that being part of being successful.
Yes,
right?
Work hard, play hard.
Good at school, play hard, get a great job, party on the weekends. And that's all part of the lifestyle, and it's celebrated.
Yeah.
But it has a dark side to it as well.
It does. And there were certainly a lot of red flags as my use was progressing. But, I didn't see them or chose to ignore them. And all of that culminated in this really tragic incident. I was in an alcohol-related drunk driving accident. My best friend and I were passengers, and she passed away from that accident, unfortunately. And I wish I could tell you that I stopped drinking, that I wish I could tell you that was a wake-up call, but unfortunately, I used alcohol and substances as a coping mechanisms for a few more years. And
there probably was a wake-up call, a realization, but the way that you were coping was by using alcohol. And so you needed to address that trauma, and you tried to fill it with more alcohol use.
Right.
And if it was easy to stop, people would. That's the other thing. A lot of people out in the public think, oh, well, if they wanted to stop, they would just stop.
Right.
But it's not that simple.
Right. And these are habits that we have to learn and build. So when I was 16, whenever I was faced with something uncomfortable, I unfortunately resorted to alcohol to manage those uncomfortable feelings. And so obviously when something really terrible happens, like, that accident, I didn't really have the social emotional skills to deal with that crisis. So at the same time, I went to grad school, and on the outside, again, I was presenting as getting on with my life, doing reasonably well in grad school, but I was really struggling on the inside, and substances works exacerbating that.
So when did things start to turn around for you?
So I wake up one morning, and this was a night after a night of heavy drinking, and a friend pulled me aside and was like, Diana, I'm really concerned about you. You're a lovely girl, bright, so much potential, but you're engaging in some really unhealthy and risky behaviors. And as this friend was telling me, I was like, I was finishing this bottle of wine by myself, and I was like, what problem? I don't know what you're talking about. I was in denial.
Denial.
Yeah. But something about the next morning, maybe it was the way he said it, and I don't know, maybe just waking up after another night of, uncontrollable drinking, I was like, I had enough. I really didn't want to keep going on that way. So I did what any, questioning person does. I opened my computer and I typed in getting help for drinking. And the first thing that came up was a 12-step group, Alcoholics Anonymous.
Alcoholics Anonymous,
yeah. So I went to my very first meeting. I called a hotline, and this person picked up, Harry, and he basically told me what they were and encouraged me to go to a meeting the next day. And that started my recovery journey. Yeah, that was about 14 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's been a really, just incredible journey. And I I remember distinctly like just not knowing how I could possibly live a life without alcohol. Like I was that attached to it. It was such a big part of my socialization, my identity, my stress relief. And so little by little, day by day in AA and eventually the therapy that I got and introducing other healthy activities into my life, I slowly learned how to manage life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then, so it's out of this personal journey, which has now created a passion for you to go and help young people as well, so that they can get help earlier, or hopefully even avoid needing to get help in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So about 4 years into my recovery, somebody heard me speaking at a meeting, AA meeting, and they introduced themselves and they're like, hey, I work for this organization. We do prevention in schools. Would you be interested? And I was like, no, I can't picture myself standing in front of an auditorium full of people sharing my story. But I kept this person's contact, and a few years later, I was moving back to the U.S. and I needed a job. So I got in touch. I went through this like really grueling recruiting process, interview process, and got a prevention specialist job with Freedom from Chemical Dependency, which was the leading prevention organization in the world. They had 40 years of history doing this work. They later merged with the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. And so I stayed with them for about 9 years and got to travel all around the world, from Dubai to Taipei, all across the United States, a lot of virtual work as well. Just working with various school communities, like very tailored prevention approaches, sometimes huge all-school assemblies, and other times small parent groups, like how do parents get involved, figuring out how do parents get involved in prevention.
And in North America, the addiction awareness and recovery support community is fairly big, fairly active, fairly vocal. Are you finding the same here in Asia, in Hong Kong, or in Chinese mainland?
The short answer is no, but I think that's starting to change. In terms of recovery, I think that it's been slowly developing. I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding around addiction, stigmatized and seen a bit as a moral failing, which makes me feel like it's even more important for me to be vocal and to speak up about it. I see that in these schools that I work with in Asia, there is a really big push to support young people holistically beyond academics, their mental health, their physical health, like it's really like supporting the whole child. But I think that there is that sort of like in international schools, I do see that, and then in Chinese local schools, there's like they're starting to have that awareness and those conversations around mental health and addiction support and prevention. But I think it's still early days.
Yeah, I think there's still a stigma associated with it, right? And this idea of losing face, and like as you said, a moral failing. That if someone is caught in addiction, then it must be a moral issue for them. They're a bad person, or that they've done things and they've done it to themselves,
right?
And then they try to keep it private. And I'm glad to hear that it's starting to change. I know international schools are talking more about it, and hopefully our communities are changing more. Now, in international schools, the students do tend to come from more affluent families.
Yeah.
And I came from a very poor family, a very broken family. I joke that my family put the fun in dysfunctional. And when I came to international scene, I thought, wow, all these people with all this money, things must be a lot easier. But actually, I don't think it is. Sometimes it's even harder because there's more pressures on the kids. Choose the right school, get into the best school, get the best marks, and the level of involvement in extracurricular activities or their sports can add a lot of pressure to young people as they're growing up. Are you finding that?
Yeah, certainly. I think that in international schools, there are unique risks, and then there are also unique protections. Many of these schools are really well resourced, so they have really invested in caring teachers that want to help kids, and they can draw from some best practices around the world. So that's a protection. And then I think in terms of risks, a lot of these families, the parents work really hard. There is this new emerging term, affluent neglect, where
Yes.
the parents are away a lot, kids are being raised by nannies or themselves sometimes. And we know that lack of supervision is, a really big risk when it comes to, teen risky behaviors. And then the pressures, like you said, the pressures students have with each other to compete into, the best colleges. But now with AI emerging, like the pressures and competing with the changing technology landscape as well, I think adds a whole new twist to the pressures that they're facing. And then I mentioned earlier, just third culture kids in general, with a lot of migration,
Yes.
they are at higher risk for just identity issues.
Right. They move a lot. They want to connect with people. So maybe they choose to go to parties and to do certain behaviors or to drink when maybe they normally wouldn't, or it goes against their values, or they go to excess. And so they're trying to find connections. So maybe they're making choices.
Absolutely.
And on top of that, the pressure as well. Now, I also suspect, because of affluence and being, high functioning families, high expectations, probably a lot of poor choices get masked. And if you're being raised by a nanny or your mom and dad aren't around a lot, that less supervision, now they can hide things a little bit easier and don't get corrected early on until it becomes a bigger problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about families first. What should parents be looking for, and how should they be looking to support their teenagers, their children?
That's a great question, and that's like a piece of the prevention puzzle I'm really passionate about. I lead a lot of parent workshops and meetings. I think that A is just bringing awareness to the issue and helping them think past this notion that not my kid, not my family, right?
Yes.
That letting them know, like, it can happen to you. Like, I am a living example of that. And then really equipping them with the tools to have these really important conversations instead of like a 60-minute lecture, integrating 60 1-minute conversations into day-to-day life. So it doesn't become like, sit down, we need to have this talk about this subject. It's more about like the piece of news that, a story that's in the news, or a movie that they're watching, or a song that they're listening to, and then, being open and hearing what the child has to say about it, and then, asking questions and using, critical thinking to think about these issues.
A lot of non-judgment is what I'm hearing here, right?
A lot of non-judgment.
If you come at it like, what are you doing? You got to stop. Then the child's going to withdraw.
Like, why would you hang out with this kid? That's a bad kid.
I liked what you said too. It's not a 60-minute conversation. It's not a family meeting. It's many 1-minute conversations. 60
1-minute conversations. I can't take credit for that one. It's a relic from our FCD days.
But I often challenge parents when they say, what do I do with my teenager? They just go into their room and lock themselves in there, or they're only on their phones. Or I said, just spend time with them. You don't have to have the big conversations as a topic. You don't need to put it in your calendar, but take them golfing, drive them to school, spend time with them, watch a movie together, do things together, and then those conversations will start to come out. It's almost proximity, those things happen organically, but you have to have that relationship. And then you add more intentionality into it as well. Now the child trusts you, you're spending time together, that communication is so important.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of research now how the simple act of having dinner together as a family on a night-to-night basis is a huge protection.
It's something we're losing, isn't it? Like, what would it be like if every family had dinner together and put their phones away during dinner? And I think as parents, we need to be careful that we're modeling the right things too. It's easy for us to criticize teenagers for their poor choices, and yet I'm checking my email at the dinner table as well as the adult. And much better if we all put our phones away, or put our phones away. We engage as a family. We spend time together, But even modeling things like not having a device at your bed,
Yeah.
so no devices in your bedroom. That applies to the kids, but and to the adults as well, because I think we're losing something by
Yeah.
always being attached to that and not having our face-to-face time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you brought up something really, really important. How is stress relief? How is fun? How is socialization being
Mm.
modeled by the parents or the caregivers? We're human. We're human, and we deserve to have fun and to relax and to, scroll Netflix. And if it's your choice, in America, there are parents using marijuana,
Mm.
to relax, and that's their legal adult right to choose that. But you have to think, like, how are my choices, influencing my child's beliefs around these, different topics? And if you do choose a certain, behavior or a certain way to have fun or to relax, talk about it,
Mm.
right? There's a real difference in adult, I'm just going to use marijuana as the example, using marijuana gummy to relax at the end of the night versus a 15-year-old or a 13-year-old. So yeah, I think it really comes down to being mindful about what is being role modeled and realizing that we're not perfect. And when we're not perfect, to be vulnerable and to have that humility to be like,
Mm.
yeah, you know what? I'm maybe not making the healthiest choice right now. And you're right. I'm going to look at that and see what's going on. And then also just, again, having regular conversations about it.
Yeah, so important. How about schools? What should schools be looking for? What can schools do to help our young people? I think all schools everywhere want students to be successful, and that doesn't just mean on their report card. We want well-rounded students. We want to make sure that there's a holistic approach to them, and we want them to be growing into healthy adults. So, how can schools bring this into their campuses?
Yeah, I think that schools need to know what is the information that kids really need around
Mm.
this topic. And so, having done this work for 10 years, I have thousands of student feedback forms of students telling me this was really helpful. This piece, I loved this piece. I wish we could have talked more about this. And through my organization, East West, we've put together a program that talks about, substances and their impacts on the teen brain. But we know that facts alone isn't enough. And so we give them skills like
Mm.
how to manage themselves in different risky situations, the exact language that they can use, if they are being offered something that they don't want to do, but
Right.
they want to maintain their face and be cool. So what can they say?
Yeah.
So really just practical skills like that. What are the signs of a developing substance problem? How do we have those really intimate but essential conversations with someone that we're worried about? Again, it goes back to being non-judgmental, validating the experience for the other person. Like, yeah, I can see that you're really struggling, you're going through a hard time. That these are all skills that I think, they're part of SEL. They're part of, but I think there's something very specific about the substance content that students need to have. For example, I didn't know this until I got to FCD, but there are standard drink sizes.
Mm.
There's a way to calculate how much alcohol is in a standard drink, and the recommended amount, the recommended rate of drinking is one standard drink per hour,
Right?
because
Yeah,
that's how long it takes the
your
liver.
body can metabolize it.
Exactly. And like, how important is that for a person to know if they choose to drink, right?
Yeah. Am I drinking too much? It's not based on my. If I don't know, I'm basing it on how I feel.
Right, which is not a good, which is not
not the right way to do it.
Right,
not very
right.
objective. But if you think, more than one drink an hour is probably going to
Mhm.
be excessive because my body won't be able to process it.
Right, yeah, and there's a lot that goes into that, body weight and age and whether you're
Mhm.
male or female, and then just genetics. But a general good rule of thumb is 1 an hour, and I have to understand if I drink faster than that rate, then my blood alcohol concentration is going to go up, and that's going to interfere with my brain and my
Mm.
ability to make decisions. And there's research that shows as students drink progressively more, they have more negative consequences. Getting into a regretful sexual situation, getting injured, getting into arguments with friends, and all of these have very real world implications, but also internally.
Yeah.
Right?
And
How they
growing up
feel.
is so hard already. Teens have
Yeah.
to make so many decisions. They have to navigate so many complex friendships and social settings. And on one hand, alcohol seems like it's going to make it easier,
Yeah.
but actually it can make it worse, because now it starts to impair that judgment where you
Yeah.
need to be making those kinds of decisions.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that schools can and should have, these like really robust, education curriculums around the main substances: alcohol, nicotine, if you're in the West, marijuana, obviously, but more broadly, the signs of addiction forming, how to intervene, what does harm reduction look like? I think sometimes people associate harm reduction with like needle exchange or,
Right. The extremes.
Yeah, the extremes, but harm reduction could be something as simple as, I'm not going to binge drink. I'm not going to drink 4 drinks in a row in a 2-hour period. I'm going to pace myself, like we just talked about, and be a lower risk drinker.
Right.
So schools can provide, those like really concrete pieces of education, information. They can also, the teachers can be really positive role models and be sources of support, especially if a young person's family, dynamics isn't as strong as it could be. There's emerging research coming out now that a very powerful protection for a kid who moves around a lot is having 2 non-parent adults, like in their day-to-day life, who are to talk to them.
Trusted adults.
A trusted adult.
Right.
Yeah. And just having that can mitigate a lot of those like transitional risks, but also for kids who do have those ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
Adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah, okay. Even if they do have a lot of those experiences, those teachers can protect against some of the worst outcomes, some of the worst like negative consequences.
Having a trusted adult is so important, and it's something that I really push in the schools that I'm involved in. And TIS McDowell did this, where they actually polled the students, and every student wrote down who's their trusted adult on campus. And what was interesting is it was very diverse. Of course, sometimes it's the homeroom teacher or a specialist teacher or a coach, but sometimes it's people that you didn't expect.
Yeah.
And then what was really neat is they then emailed those names to the person who was named. And all of a sudden, the secretary is like, what? I've got kids who feel like I'm their trusted adult. She thinks I'm just the secretary, but everyone plays a role.
Yeah.
And we can all build relationships with kids. And that's going to help kids navigate the complexity of growing up and help them make decisions. And that a trusted adult can be someone who helps monitor and advise them as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that. I love that story. Yeah.
Great. And I think we have to be very fair here too, that substance abuse doesn't just affect teens. I think there's lots of people probably listening, teachers, school leaders, high functioning, socially acceptable people who are probably struggling as well with drinking, with addiction of one type or another. What would you say to them?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think the very first thing is to have awareness, right? That you are struggling. Yeah. So if you are exhibiting some of the signs of, setting limits, but breaking them, trying to cut back, but being unable to.
That compulsiveness, right?
Yeah.
Manageable.
Right. If you are finding yourself, craving it or thinking about it a lot when you're not doing it. If you are going through withdrawal, when you aren't engaging in the substance, how it affects your relationships, but also your relationship with yourself. How does your use make you feel about yourself?
That mental talk. And are you living according to your values? If you're aligned with your values, if you're making choices outside your values, it inside.
Yeah.
And it's bothering you.
Right.
That's probably a good sign that something needs to be corrected.
Right. Yeah. Or if you're being secretive about, the behavior, then that's also a red flag.
Big red flag.
So the most important thing is, just having the awareness that something might be a little bit off. And then the second piece is to get help, because this is, it's really hard to navigate this on
And
your
I think
own.
get help sounds simple. It's not. It's the
Hmm.
first step. They have to admit that they have a problem and they need help. And I think a lot of times we as adults, we just say, I can do it by myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do better next time.
Yeah.
I'll stop. I'll cut
Yeah.
back. But the reality is we need help. We all
Yeah.
need support in order to overcome these types of things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then it's about getting the right type of help. And there's a lot out there, and sometimes it can be really tricky to navigate, but just not giving up and trying different things, whether it's a peer support group or a one-to-one therapist, in person, online, coaching. There's so much out there now. Yeah.
Platforms.
Yeah. And each has its, unique advantages. Yeah.
Just to kind of wrap up, if there are schools that are listening and they want to bring East West in to help support what they're doing for their teens and their students, where are you working? What's your scope? And how do they get in touch with you?
Sure. So I'm based in Guangzhou, southern China, but I can travel to any school. So basically, we would have an initial consultation to see what their needs are, what their timeline looks like, their resources, and then I would put together a tailored program, whether that's student-based or family-based, and then I would just travel there and deliver this important work.
Very important.
Yeah.
Work. Well, Diana, you're doing wonderful work, and your own journey is very inspiring.
Thank
And
you.
I hope it inspires other people to get help, and that they can start really living the life that they want to live as well. So
Thank you
for
so
all
much,
that you're doing.
Howard. Yeah, thank you for your time.